We can look at the craziness in the world and really begin to wonder, is there anything I can do to help? We can feel so small, we can feel so powerless, we can feel so weak. In this video, let's know His love in our weaknesses. It can be so incredibly hard as we come face to face with our limitations. As a child, we may be able to live in a fantasy world where our imaginations lead us to believe that we're the strongest or the fastest. But as we grow older and begin to face genuine challenges in life, the full weight of reality begins to bear down on us. Classmates can run faster or get better scores on exams. Someone else was better qualified for a job or was chosen for a promotion over us. But our limitations, these weaknesses, they're just based on performances at school or work or even in athletics. We can face physical weaknesses that, due to age or disability, limit our ability, our sight, our hearing. We can even face psychological weaknesses that affect our emotions or means of processing the world around us so strongly that each day becomes a living hell. Our weaknesses can be exposed as we find that we're simply unable to help people that we care about the most. We can see a child struggling with a severe illness, someone that we love is suffering from a serious addiction, or we can see someone fading away as death overtakes them, and no matter how much we try to control the situation, we come to that point where our own capacity to really do anything is exhausted by our own human frailty. When our weaknesses are exposed, I think that a normal reaction is to try to cover them up, to hide them away, and hide these things away we think that these things, they make us less in the eyes of those around us. And we can come to the point where we hate our weaknesses. We can hate that we aren't strong enough, that we aren't fast enough, that we aren't smart enough, that we aren't witty enough. We can see our weaknesses as a greatest threat to who we are and to everything that we want to accomplish in this life. Yet at the end of the day, we still carry these weaknesses with us. And to be clear, there are ways to run longer distances, to lift heavier weights, to play increasingly more difficult concertos, and it's good to strive for excellence. But many times when we're faced with our weaknesses, we become sickened by what we see to the point that we react with it by seeking a human perfectionism that devolves into nothing more than a demonic narcissism. How we react to our weaknesses, how we respond to our weaknesses, not only tells us a lot about how we see ourselves, but also how we believe how God sees us. We may see ourselves as unlovable until we reach some arbitrary and always out of reach standard of perfection. This incredibly warped view of God and of ourselves, it must be addressed. And if we really want to come to know His love, we have to be able to know His love in our weaknesses. Because whatever our weaknesses may be, whether they are physical or psychological or spiritual, far from being the greatest threat to who we are, they're actually the greatest superpower we can possess. It seems so counterintuitive. How can something that I want to hide away so that no one, including myself, will be ever able to see them again, how can these things actually be my greatest strength? Yet if we look to St. Paul, we see a great example because he's no stranger to weakness. His entire world was turned upside down by an encounter with Christ that for a time left him unable to see. And this vulnerable time was incredibly important to Paul. He had to depend and rely on people, many people he didn't even know. This time of weakness, for Paul, isn't something he ran from. He embraced it. In his second letter to the church in Corinth, Paul leans into his weakness. He's proud of his weakness because through it, he's able to show Christ's power all the more. I think my favorite example of this is found in the 11th chapter of 2 Corinthians, as Paul recounts what happened to him as he was trying to leave Damascus. He said that the king was trying to protect the city or guard the city from him leaving. He says that as he was trying to leave Damascus in order to seize him, he was let down in a basket through a window in the wall and escaped his hands. Can you imagine how humiliating it would have been, how out of control the situation Paul must have felt as he was being lowered out of a window in a basket? Yet this story tells us so much. In the eyes of the world, this is failure. This is laughable. This shouldn't be a figure that we esteem. And if Paul really wanted to have a good reputation for the churches that he was ministering to, he should have bragged about the people he converted, or how much money he raised, or how many arguments he won. But he doesn't do that. Instead, he slips in this humiliating story that emphasizes his weakness. But it isn't emphasizing weakness for its own sake. Paul shows us that weakness, because of this, he knows that Christ shines through it. Paul tells us, "Therefore I will boast all the more gladly of my weaknesses, so that the power of Christ may rest upon me. For the sake of Christ, then, I am content with weaknesses, insults, hardships, persecutions, and calamities. For when I am weak, then I am strong." And this is the key. This is the lens through which our weaknesses can actually become our greatest strength. Instead of feeling repulsed by our weakness, we can see our frailty and lack as an opportunity to turn to God and say, "I just can't do this alone. I need you." I don't think that this aversion to weakness that results in self-hatred, it comes out of nowhere. I'm sure that there are many factors that come into play. But as we explore this, it's important that we don't reduce everything to a purely human, psychological, or sociological development. We also need to see the spiritual roots of this rejection of weakness as well. And if we go back to the beginning, if we look to the serpent in Genesis, to Satan, we see someone who hates weakness. He hates it so much because it means that he isn't God, that he is a creature rather than the creator. And when Satan looks at us, all he sees is weakness, which he hates. And his greatest trick is to get us to hate it too. But when we stop treating our weaknesses as an enemy and instead see them as an opportunity to abandon ourselves to God's care, it changes us. God doesn't see our weaknesses and run from them. He doesn't see our pain and our suffering and decide to move on to caring for someone who may have their life better put together. God doesn't reject weakness. He is drawn towards it. We hear it in Jesus' own words. "Those who are well have no need of a physician, but those who are sick. I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners to repentance." He is calling out. He's calling out to those who in their weaknesses have doubts. He's calling to those who struggle with the same sin over and over and over again. He's calling out to those who think that they can't make it through another day. He's calling out to the weak. He's calling out to you. He's calling out to me. But if we hate our weaknesses, this means that we're covering our ears and ignoring the call. We refuse the possibility of God working through our poverty. And this isn't just weaknesses of body and mind, but a spirit as well. We can try to reject our spiritual weaknesses, like sin, in so many ways. In this, I'm not saying that we should love sinning, but I do think that in an effort to separate ourselves from our spiritual weaknesses, we end up not only trying to hide them from ourselves, but from God as well. We can go into the confessional and instead of naming our sin and looking at our weakness, leaning into our weaknesses and letting God's mercy work through them, we instead try to obscure or to try to hide the sin. We talk about our sin in overly pious language, or we can try to hide the reality of what we really did through euphemisms or using incredibly general or vague words. But when we name the sin, when we name the weakness, when we do that, we let it not have power over us anymore. And instead we let God's transforming power of love work in us. The Belgian priest, Father Wilfred Stinnesen, tells us that poverty of heart is not always very beautiful. It's not necessarily the fruit of ascetic virtues. It can be a physical or psychological handicap. But what renders a person incompetent in the eyes of the world is precisely that which can give a person access to the reign of God. If we say yes to God, we choose the narrow path that brings us to the reign of God. Our poverty then becomes blessed, and we become humble servants or servants of the Lord through whom he can do great things. One thing is central to the gospel. God became man to save the poor. Poverty and weaknesses are never an obstacle. He did not come for those who are well, but for those who are ill. When we are ready not to repress our poverty or anxiety, but to welcome it freely, Jesus can become what his name signifies, the one who saves. The divine physician is calling out to your heart, and his word has power. He speaks with authority and has power to heal and to enter into our weaknesses with us. But it always starts with a question, as he lovingly asks us every single day, do you want to be well? Listen to his call. Listen for the question. Instead of repressing what makes us weak, invite him into that place within you, so that, like Paul, we can also say, for when I am weak, then I am strong.